Chapter 5. Despite my curiosity, we didn't see Micah or Jimmy for days, not until Betty and I discovered the river. In New York, we never swam, only played in water shooting out from hydrants on hot concrete during the summer months. But now we played in the stretch of river right behind Nana's house, where the water was warm and slow and shallow. I tried not to be frightened of all the small fish and slugs and bugs floating up from the squishy mud bottom. One afternoon, our father read Huckleberry Finn to us on the banks of the Crow. The Crow River leads all the way to Tom and Huck's Mississippi. He looked down the graceful river that snaked endlessly between cornfields. My face must have lit up a little too much. "It's 500 miles, he said, eyeing me. "That's a long way." This only led me to the conclusion that Biddy and I needed our own Tom and Huck. We knew 2 boys. I avoided face-to-face contact with Gacy Cutter by writing a letter of invitation. When the boys wrote back that very next day, I just knew from Micah's typewritten note on turquoise paper that we were destined to be the best of friends, and that is what happened. They were forgiven for their early offense, and Micah and Jimmy accepted us into their friendship like we'd always been a part of it. As July slipped into August, our lives took on a sort of structure and routine. Every morning, starting at the breakfast table, where Nana warned of the river and those boys and that woman. "The water barely covers our ankles, Nana," and I watched Biddy every second, which was kind of true. "The river is fine," my father said, looking up at me from the brain journal he was reading. "As long as you stay right behind the house where it's shallow. You'll only get into trouble farther up, when it gets deep and current picks up." I nodded encouragingly at Nana, who sputtered like a tea kettle at my father's rare contradiction. "Today, I'm going to bring Willowdale with us," I said. "To see your mother?" Nana asked. "No, to pick up Micah and Jimmy." "Vienna hates cows," Biddy added. Just days earlier, my father had surprised me with my very own registered cow. Most cows are mutts, named something like Sadie, Bessie, or Freckles, but my cow came with an ancestral pedigree, recorded physical assets, and fat statistics. Instantly smitten with my golden-haired pet and her large chocolate drippy eyes, I named her Willowdale Princess Dion Dawn. Never in my life had I given anything the name of princess, but that's what my cow was. "First, you won't go near the Cutter house, and now you spend all your time there?" I could hear the disapproval in Nana's voice, especially as she had introduced me to several perfectly nice but perfectly boring girls the week before. When I mentioned Micah and Jimmy to them, I got the sense that nobody, and I mean nobody, was calling up Gacy Cutter to arrange a playdate. "I don't talk to Gacy," I said. "How are you going to get Willowdale there?" "I'm going to ride her," I smiled, pleased with myself. "Well, I have heard it all now." Nana dropped her cleaning rag right onto the floor. "Jed, do you hear this? Cows are not horses." My father raised an eyebrow. "It's really not funny, Jed. You're encouraging her." Guinevere, I'm afraid, is the type of child who will have to learn many hard lessons from personal experience. Who does that remind you of? Nana shook her head and began to intently scrub the floor. "Who?" I said. "Your mother had a penchant for mischief," Nana said. Thankfully, she grew out of it and became a lady. I went outside, mulling over this new information, trying to picture Vienna running wild around Crow, sniffing the air. I also wondered when manure would start to smell appealing. Despite Nana's strong words against it, Biddy and I awkwardly rode on golden-haired Willowdale Princess down Lanark Lane to Micah's house. I would never admit it in 1,000 years, but Nana's disapproval was well-founded. It was terrifying and terribly slow riding atop a large moving animal. Willowdale Princess Dion Dawn had a very large mouth and giant teeth that were always dripping with saliva, as she meandered here and there, chewing on grass for long stretches and stared at nothing for even longer stretches. Just when I'd get comfortable, she'd lurch forward, nearly making me topple right off. I finally ended up pulling her by the rope tied around her neck while enduring a thoroughly slow and scenic tour down Lanark Lane. By the time we arrived at Micah's, I was drenched with sweat and fuming. I tied Willowdale's rope to an orange porch slat. "Be good," I instructed before Betty and I ran through the plowed corn path. hearing the honking of the goose and arriving just in time to see Jimmy swinging across the river on a rope swing and drop himself in. "Hey," Mike called to us. He stood on a rock, wearing green swim trunks and glorious homemade purple cape. "What took so long?" Jimmy yelled, coming up from the water and flicking his black hair out of his eyes. "I brought a surprise," I yelled. Though I wasn't an expert swimmer, I stripped down to my bathing suit and jumped in. It was a deliciously cold and wonderful feeling, unlike anything I'd ever experienced in New York. The current was slow, and I shut my eyes, letting myself get carried down a moment. The sweat and grime washed off my body. I resurfaced and walked against the current, thigh deep, back to Biddy, who tentatively put her feet in the water as it slowly swirled around her legs like a curl of hair. While Biddy played, I climbed onto a large, warm rock where Micah sat. "Where's the surprise?" Micah asked. "At your house, but let's swim first." Micah looked down at the water. "Come on, scaredy cat," Jimmy said, wading toward us. "Jimmy, stop," Micah frowned, pulling his bony knees to his chest. "Ah, come on," Jimmy said, climbing up next to us and sopping wet cut-off blue jeans and lying down on the warm rock. "It's like 2 feet deep." "Maybe if I had an inner tube to float on," Micah said, doubtfully. I lay on my stomach, watching the dark water swirl in currents. The water was shredded by trees and forests, but every so often, scattered light escaped through, shooting out yellow and white shades all over the leaves, rocks, and speckled water. "If we had an inner tube, we could sail down the river to the Mississippi," I said. "We're not allowed," Micah said. "It gets real deep. Ma's predicting a real wet spring, and it's gonna rise even higher." "She says that every year," Jimmy said. "And if it floods, all the corn will die," Micah said. "Once, the river flooded the whole town, and everyone had to evacuate, and all the corn was drowned." "That's a true story," he shivered and exchanged a look with Jimmy. "What?" I asked. Jimmy shrugged. "He don't like the word drowned." "You mean he doesn't?" "Whatever. There was a bad sledding accident a long time ago, right on this river. Gacy crashed right through the ice." I perked up. "That's why Gacy's all messed up," Jimmy continued, tracing an imaginary scar down his face. "And no one likes her, and it's why Micah is scared to have fun." "I am not." "But why doesn't Micah like the word drowned?" Biddy asked fearfully. "'Cause of Myron," Jimmy said. "Myron?" I whispered. Vienna had said his name. Who's Myron? Jimmy and Micah glanced at each other. "Tell me." "He's the one who didn't make it," Micah said sorrowfully. The hair on my arms stood straight up, and I was brought back to my near burial, with Gacy hovering over me. I had a million questions, but seeing the terrified look on Biddy's face, I swallowed them and lightened my voice. "Jimmy is right, Micah. Look how shallow the water is here. No one's going to drown." I knelt down to touch the water. I wanted to see the soul of a boy named Myron, but instead I saw my reflection wobbling all over the place, brown hair that never lay flat, and my father's deep, dark thinking eyes that blended right into the river rocks. Biddy's hair was curly and wild too, but blonde like Vienna's. It gave her a cute, impish style, whereas mine looked only like I had forgotten to brush. "Well, I'd still ride to Mississippi," Jimmy said. "Throw a rock at my reflection, scattering it farther into the water. I'm not afraid. And when I get to wherever I'm going to be a barber and have a tattoo and never come back." "I've never known anyone who wanted to be a barber," I said. "He's going to call his shop Lucky's and give me free haircuts," Micah said, rubbing his head. "You'll come back. You'd miss your family." "Nope," Jimmy interrupted me. "No, I would not." I could see why he wouldn't miss Gacy, though I didn't know if he had any other family, considering he seemed to always be at Micah's house. "Well, you'd miss Micah then." Jimmy considered this. I wanted him to say he'd miss Biddy and me, but he didn't. "My father came back to Crow," I said, swatting at mosquitoes. "He even likes the smell of cow poop," Biddy added. We were interrupted by a black blur flashing through the trees on the other side of the river. I leaped up, and the blur disappeared with a thrashing noise through the trees. "What was that?" "Maybe a giraffe," Biddy asked. "Ah, it's just the creepers," Jimmy said, standing. "Let's go get a popsicle." He made his way down the bank and began to walk across the river. "Who are the creepers?" Why do you ask so many questions? She's practicing to be a lawyer, Biddy answered for me. I scrutinized the woods. All was quiet again, like nothing had been there at all. I shivered. Sometimes quiet Iowa was scarier than crazy loud New York ever was. I wish it had been a giraffe, Biddy said. Race ya, Jimmy yelled, taking off ahead of me. Cheater! The creek was only a couple 100 feet from Gacy's house, and I was fast, but Jimmy gave me fierce competition, making it out of the cornfield just ahead of me. I was gaining when he stopped so abruptly we both crashed to the ground. Before I could yell at Jimmy, I froze in horror. Gacy's yard was a disaster. The goose was flapping its wings, honking in distress. Flowers of every color were strewn about, stems broken off, begonias trampled, and there was Willowdale, satisfied with the meal she had inhaled. Right on top of the baby pool, now squashed flat, her golden tail swished back and forth as she stared at me. Around her neck was the rope, and a broken orange slat pulled from Gacy's wraparound porch. I heard the sound of Gacy's raised voice before seeing her emerge from the side of the house, stomping, hands flailing wildly about her. I wanted to sink into the earth and never come out again. Following behind Gacy was a very confused-looking Wilbur. There, Gacy boomed, her eyes blazing hot with anger as she pointed at the mess. There! I trembled, a squeak coming out of my throat. Micah looked at me distressed. Was that your surprise? Jimmy asked. Gacy continued to rail. Well now, Gacy, we could barely hear Wilbur stammer. I don't know what... You don't know. Of course you don't, because you're an imbecile. Honk. Shut up, Gacy roared at the goose. It waddled away toward the little white house next door and honked, but from a safer distance. Wilbur began, taking off his cowboy hat to fan himself. What kind of man brings a brainless, blockhead animal of the bovine variety into this backyard, knowing... Gacy said, her voice rising as she gestured in big, wide circles. The bestial behaviored cattle are prone to... It's ruined. Look around. It's ruined. It is all ruined, and it's not just my work. It's all of your work, too. She was going to enter the Crow Flower Bazaar, Micah said, and win first place over Dottie and Lavinia. They don't like Gacy, Jimmy added. Says she's crazy and prone to flying off the handle. Can't imagine why. I'm so dead, I whispered, beginning to chew my nails. Yep, Jimmy said cheerfully. Gosh, sometimes I just wanted to hit him. Gacy wiped her hand across her nose. The mess you have made is just beyond me, the stupidity of your actions. Days, months, years of work. I honestly cannot believe a grown man with even half a brain would fail to foresee the consequences of his actions. I'm not speaking to you ever again. Go away and sit in your little house out of my sight, Gacy cried, gesturing to the small cottage that sat away from the main house, where he had recently learned Wilbur lived. Though why he'd want to live near such an awful woman was beyond me. She turned and cried out again, My sunflowers! Watching Wilbur not saying anything, not even trying to defend himself, was too hard to bear. I took a small step forward, gripping the back of my small neck with my hands. The curtain moved from inside the house next door. The goose honked. Gacy's voice grew louder and louder. I walked to my death slowly across the lawn and past Willowdale, who continued to lazily chew on Gacy's grass. Naughty, I hissed at her, then turned to Gacy. Mrs. Cutter? She turned to snarl at me. Micah said you're an up-and-coming lawyer, but don't even think of defending this stupid man who cares more about being out with his blue mistress than paying attention to good sense. The mistress again. Ah, you see, I rushed on. Willowdale Princess Dion Don is my cow, and I'm a very bad cow owner. I'm training her to act like a horse instead of a cow, but, I've failed. She was very wicked to ruin your porch and your flowers. Wait, Gacy said, holding out her hands to stop the universe. You're telling me that this thing in my yard, indicating Willowdale, is your cow? Yes. She took 2 aggressive steps toward Wilbur. There was a collective flinch. Unbelievable, she spit out. You stand there and say absolutely nothing to defend yourself? Gacy turned and marched into the house. Biddy reached up and took my hand. which was now wet and clammy. "I'm so sorry, Wilbur," I said, dragging my feet over to him. Seeing Wilbur up close was an education on sun damage. I had never seen so many sunspots or such wrinkled leather on anyone's face before. He turned to me, his eyes gentle. "I didn't know she'd do that," I said. "Yep, cows can be beasts, all right," Wilbur said. "And Gacy, too," I said. He looked at me and laughed a short bark. "Huh? That woman is like a hurricane meeting a tornado sometimes," he said conspiratorially. "I'm actually afraid of what she'll do. I wish you all the luck." He gave me a wink before shuffling to Gacy's. His old shoulders stooped. He knocked on the door. "Come on," Gacy yelled. "And you too, girls." I squeezed Biddy's hand tightly before stepping inside the monster's lair. The boys followed. The walls were surprisingly happy, sunflower yellow, but decorated with small pieces of stuff Nana would call clutter. Wilbur patted both boys in the back, poured himself and Gacy a cup of coffee, placed the cup in front of her, and settled down into a chair. "Best part of the day," he said. "Coffee break with Gacy Cutter." I made a face. How could that be anyone's best part of the day? "Don't you try to butter me up," Gacy said to Wilbur. "I'm still angry." She was sunk down into a chair, eyes closed, fanning herself. She was doing some sort of breathing exercise. Breathe in and hold. 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 And exhale slowly, like one of those birthing shows I watched in the hospital lounges. Jimmy and Micah were already into the popsicles, as if my impending death was no big whoop. Biddy and I stood in the doorway until Gacy finally opened her eyes. "Sit," she commanded. We sat. "Oh, my temper, my terrible, terrible temper." She gave herself 3 mighty whacks across her own cheeks. "Wilbur Truesdale, I apologize." "I'm very sorry," I said again. It was irresponsible of me to tie her up to the porch. "Well, we can certainly agree on that." Wilbur, now safe from wrath, closed his eyes, pulled down his hat, and seemed to fall asleep instantly, sitting upright despite the steaming mug of caffeine in front of him. "Willowdale, what?" Gacy asked me. "Princess Dion Dawn." Micah stood and stretched, walking to the middle of the kitchen, and began to lower himself into the gymnastic splits position. "Hurts just looking at you," Jimmy said. "Please just stop." Gacy looked at Micah. "Son, what are you doing?" "Showing you my splits so you won't be mad at Gwen anymore. She's already scared of you." "I am not." Gacy turned to me and raised an eyebrow. I felt my face go hot. "Training a cow to act like a horse?" I nodded. "Well, I believe you just might be the girl to do such a thing." "You have to practice every day," Micah said, holding his hands elegantly out to the side. "Your cow?" Gacy said loudly, pounding down hard on the table. She began to laugh so hard, tears rolling down her face. "Stop it, Mom. You're going to make me pee," Micah said, balancing precariously. Gacy took one look at him, trying to lower into the splits in his green swim shorts and purple cape, and burst out laughing again. "You only have yourself to blame," Gacy heaved, her large chest moving up and down, contorting yourself into such a position. "Oh dear, my bladder is not what it used to be. Oh dear." Biddy and I stared wide-eyed as Gacy shook with laughter before easing herself off the wooden chair and waddling out of the kitchen, a big wet spot dripping from the back of her pants. "That," I whispered to Biddy, "is a very strange woman." Wilbur sat up from his nap, put his hat back in place, and finished his cup of coffee. He stood and shook his hand, and then Biddy's. "Never a dull moment around here. Now that she's speaking to me again, it's back to work." As much as I was relieved not to be dead, I pondered his earlier words. What had Wilbur meant? Afraid of what she'll do?